A real man doesn't cry. He doesn't talk about his feelings. He solves his problems with violence. He drinks, he smokes, and he walks away from an explosion without looking back. For decades, this has been the blueprint for masculinity on screen. But at what cost? Hi everyone, you're watching Femme Fatale's Heels channel, where we talk about women, film, and women in film. But sometimes we make an exception. And in this video, we will look at how the image of the real man has been portrayed in film, because we often explore female characters and the female experience, especially how patriarchal storytelling shapes stereotypes about women. So we thought it would be interesting to explore a male side of that contrast, to see how men and women have been represented so differently in cinema for so long. For decades, men have dominated filmmaking, and that's inevitably influenced how male experience has been portrayed on screen. While 10 or 15 years ago, complex female roles were still relatively rare, men were already allowed to play a wide variety of characters, with different stories, emotions, and personalities. That's why this video won't try to cover all types of the male characters. There are simply too many, since for a long time male stories were the default and often the only stories being told. So instead, we will focus on one specific aspect, toxic masculinity, and how it's been constructed in cinema. We will look at the narratives of so-called real men, what they reinforce, and why it's so long overdue that we let go of these limiting, stereotypical ideas, both on screen and off. Hi everyone, it's Alona from editing here. So while you can see the spoiler warning, I will also clear a few things. In this video, yet again, I couldn't use some shots from the films, mainly the films American Psycho, Barbie, and series Adolescence. And it's always a shame to me that, I put so many time into editing and then I just can show the parts of it. I don't like using screenshots, but in this case I simply have to, because otherwise I won't have any visuals for a film and YouTube will demonetize or even block the video. So I've started a Patreon where I upload the original editings of the videos, and if you want to support my work or maybe just to see separate videos in the original editing, you can do it there, and I will be truly grateful for your support. And now let's get back to the video. But first, let's clarify, what exactly do we mean by toxic masculinity? It refers to a set of cultural norms and behaviors that define masculinity through dominance, emotional suppression, aggression, and the rejection of anything associated with femininity. Toxic masculinity promotes the idea that real men should be tough, emotionally detached, and always in control, often at the expense of their mental health and relationships. But it's important to clarify, this concept doesn't claim that masculinity is toxic. Rather, it critiques the harmful aspects of traditional gender roles that pressure men to suppress vulnerability, avoid empathy, and assert dominance through violence or control. Toxic masculinity isn't just cinematic trope, it's rooted in the broader system of patriarchy, a social structure created, upheld, and still maintained by men to preserve power and dominance. Within this system, traditional masculinity was constructed not only to elevate men above women, but also to control other men by enforcing strict gender norms. Patriarchy encourages traits like aggression, emotional detachment, and dominance, while pushing softness, vulnerability, and empathy by labeling them as weak or feminine. This creates a version of masculinity that ultimately harms everyone. It justifies male violence, blocks emotional expression, and traps men in a cycle of inner pressure and repression. Yet in cinema, toxic masculinity has long been idealized, framed as the mark of a real man who command respect and success. Already in 1930s to 1950s, Hollywood helped shape a masculine idea built on emotional repression and control. Take Humphrey Bogart, for example, star of Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon, an icon of his generation who embodied the detached, cynical anti-hero. His characters were cool-headed, emotionally unavailable, and always in the control of situation. John Wayne is another cultural landmark, both in film and American identity. Famous for his roles in westerns like The Searchers, Wayne portrayed masculinity through dominance, stoicism, and moral rigidity. His characters rarely showed emotions, except for anger or thirst for revenge. These men were admired, but they also taught audiences that masculinity meant independence achieved through dominance over sensitivity, and actions prioritized over introspection. But it's important to recognize that film roles are never just cultural, they're also social and political. For example, in 1930s and 50s in the US were marked by mass unemployment and economic despair due to Great Depression. Many men felt powerless, unable to fulfill the traditional role of the provider. In response, Hollywood films often portrayed men as stoic, emotionally restrained, and strong-willed, idealized figures who remained in control even in the face of hardship. We also can ignore the World War II, after which masculinity became associated with heroism, sacrifice, and duty. Men were expected to be physically resilient and emotionally tough. Vulnerability was seen as weakness. In the post-war era, there was a powerful push to return to traditional family values. Men were encouraged to provide for their families and reassert their roles as heads of the household, in direct response to the growing independence of women during the war. Now, I'm not going on about American history because I'm a huge fan of the US, but because how American films portrayed masculinity shaped global perceptions of it. Hollywood had a worldwide impact. These masculine archetypes were exported across the globe, helping establish cultural standards of what it meant to be a man in many countries, often reinforcing patriarchal values and definitions of male identity far beyond US. From the 1970s to the 1990s, masculinity in film evolved, but in many ways it still was connected to toxicity. These decades didn't reject traditional masculinity, they often glorified it, especially through violence, inner torment, and anti-hero narratives. This era gave a rise to a wave of emotionally repressed, self-destructive, or hyper-aggressive men, often presented as heroic figures. Martin Scorsese's antiheroes were especially influential, both culturally and critically. His films Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, and Casino featured protagonists who were violent, emotionally broken, and deeply entrenched in violence. Take Taxi Driver, for example. Travis Bickle embodies extreme alienation, emotional repression, a need for control and dominance, and violent outbursts. Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull is another example of toxic masculinity, possessive, jealous, and abusive, both physically and emotionally. To be fair, Scorsese often portrays these men through a critical lens, but even then the depth and complexity of their psychological portraits tends to mythologize this model of masculinity. And in his later films like The Departed and The Wolf of Wall Street, Scorsese still depicts toxic masculinity with a degree of empathy, encouraging the audience to emotionally connect with these characters. I'm not saying Scorsese is a problematic or bad director. Personally, I love his films, but I do think he only recently started stepping away from glorifying toxic masculinity in films, like in The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon. Aside from Robert De Niro, who played many of Scorsese's most iconic roles, other cinematic icons of the time included Al Pacino and Marlon Brando. Films like The Godfather, Scarface, and Apocalypse Now portrayed hyper-masculine, power-hungry leaders, emotionally distant men who solved problems through intimidation or violence. Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger also became defining figures of this era. Their films like Rocky, Rambo, and The Terminator emphasized physical dominance, emotional suppression, and revenge-driven narratives. These roles equated masculinity with brute force and military-style control. And again, this wasn't just cultural, it was political political and social. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. Veterans returned home alienated and traumatized. Films like Taxi Drivers and Rambo reflected this crisis of masculinity, portraying men who couldn't reintegrate, who felt powerless and eventually snapped. At the same time, civil rights movements were gaining more traction. Women and other marginalized groups were demanding equality, and many men began to feel that their traditional roles were under threat. As a result, films from this era often depict men desperately trying to maintain control over women, over their work, or over themselves. The 1980s also saw a rise in conservative values under President Reagan. His policies encouraged a return to traditional values and the idea of the strong man, both politically and culturally. It was reflected in films through macho characters like Stallone and Schwarzenegger. Then, in 1999, David Fincher's Fight Club was released, based on the novel by Chuck Palahniuk. It became one of the most iconic and complex critiques of toxic masculinity in modern cinema, because it both depicts and critiques the psychological collapse of modern masculinity, especially white middle-class masculinity, at the end of the 20th century. Fight Club explored themes of emotional repression and male alienation. The unnamed narrator represents a man numbed by consumerism and modern life. In contrast, Tyler Durden enters the story as hyper-masculine ideal, a fantasy of unchecked, violent, primal masculinity, confident, fearless, dominant, anti-authoritarian. He rejects social norms and capitalism, but his alternative is no less extreme: chaos, violence, control, and domination. The plot twist that Tyler is a projection of the narrator's psyche symbolizes that toxic masculinity is a response to inner crisis, not a true source of strength. The film shows that rejecting vulnerability and emotional growth leads to self-destruction. And yet, it's interesting how many viewers at the time misunderstood the film. Rather than reading it as a critique of toxic masculinity, they saw it as a celebration of it. The film's raw depiction of violence and rebellion against the system led some, especially young men, to view Tyler Durden as a heroic figure and Fight Club as a kind of anti-social empowerment movement. For these viewers, Tyler's rejection of consumerism and embrace of physical violence and dominance felt like a call to reclaim masculinity in a world they saw as too soft or politically correct. They gravitated toward the aggressive, action-driven parts of the film, without fully understanding the deeper commentary on the dangers of emotional repression, self-destruction, and empty power fantasies. In reality, Fight Club became something of an anthem for a certain group of men who felt alienated and wanted to reclaim what they saw as their lost masculinity. The film remains especially popular among various misogynistic communities, including the so-called Incels, members of an online subculture who consider themselves involuntarily celibate, unable to form romantic or sexual relationships despite wanting them. But we will talk more about incels later. When director David Fincher was asked about the film's popularity among incels and far-right, he said, "We didn't make this movie for them, but people are going to see what they're going to see. I can't believe people don't understand that Tyler Durden is a negative influence, and I don't know how to respond to that, and I don't know how to help them." Fight Club is far from the only film that was originally intended as a critique of toxic masculinity, but ended up becoming a cult favorite and a symbol of so-called incel culture. If you're enjoying this video, please consider leaving a like or even a comment and subscribing to the channel, because it really helps our videos to reach more people, and YouTube really likes when people are interacting with the content while watching it, so it will truly mean a lot. The film American Psycho and its protagonist Patrick Bateman can also be read as a sharp commentary on toxic masculinity, but like Fight Club, it has been reinterpreted as a symbol of male dominance. At the center of the story is Patrick Bateman, a wealthy, outwardly successful New York investment banker who leads a double life as a violent serial killer. On the surface, Bateman embodies the hyper-masculine ideal: attractive, rich, well-dressed, is socially powerful. His life revolves around superficial values, material wealth, social status, and appearance. But his perfection is a mask for inner emptiness and dissatisfaction. His compulsive need to assert power and violence, especially over women, exposes a deep sense of insecurity beneath his masculine facade. Bateman's attitude toward women is extreme. He objectifies, manipulates, and murders them without remorse. His violence is not only physical, but also psychological. His behavior reflects deeply rooted misogyny and entitlement, both of which are central to toxic masculinity. Women become objects for his gratification, both sexual and violent. In doing so, the film critiques how patriarchal systems dehumanize women and reinforce male dominance in personal relationships. Moreover, Bateman's life is marked by a narcissistic obsession with appearance and status, but he lacks any real sense of self. His confusion about his own identity, his uncertainty over whether he's actually committing the murders or just imagining them, illustrates the hollowness and instability at the heart of societal ideas of masculinity. Despite the film's clear critique of toxic masculinity, American Psycho has also become a symbol of male rage and entitlement, especially in the same incel communities. Some fans admire Bateman's confidence and how he seizes power and control over others, instead of recognizing his behavior as a reflection of a broken masculine system. They view him as a symbol of the male strength in a world they believe is hostile to them. They mistakenly interpret Bateman's behavior as empowering, seeing his violent outbursts as a form of taking back male control, despite the film clearly showing that his actions stem from deep psychological issues and social alienation. Bateman's obsessive objectification and violence towards women is echoed by some members of the incel community, who view women not as equals but as prizes to be won or controlled. They misread Bateman's violent tendencies as justified rage against social rejection and unfair treatment by women, reflecting their own distorted sense of entitlement, or rather their lack of any. But toxic masculinity itself isn't a fixed concept. It evolves over time, shaped by changing cultural, social, and political landscapes. And one of the clearest examples of this evolution is James Bond franchise, a series that both reinforced and later deconstructed traditional masculine ideas. When James Bond first hit the screen in the 1960s with Sean Connery as the iconic spy, he embodied a classic image of toxic masculinity: dominant, emotionally detached, and always ready to use violence to solve problems. Bond's persona was built on hypermasculine traits, where stoicism, physical power, and sexual conquest were central to his identity. The early Bond films rarely portrayed meaningful emotional relationships. Women were often reduced to objects of desire or conquest. This version of James Bond helped cement the stereotype that men should be emotionally cold, physically dominant, and indifferent to vulnerability. But over the years, and especially with cultural shifts that brought more visibility to the experience of women and marginalized groups, the portrayal of Bond began to change. In Daniel Craig's portrayal, Bond became a more multidimensional and emotionally vulnerable character. Starting with Casino Royale, Craig's Bond moved away from the stoic, emotionally distant figure of earlier films, and instead became more human, someone forced to confront his emotions, trauma, and relationships. This shift was a direct response to the growing awareness of the harmful effects of rigid, toxic masculinity. It helped demonstrate that men, even in traditionally masculine roles, can experience emotional depth and vulnerability without losing their masculinity. This emotional arc reaches its peak in No Time to Die 2021, where Bond not only cries and openly expresses his vulnerability, but also embraces fatherhood, a major transformation for a character, once defined by his emotional detachment. By allowing Bond to show care, love, and grief, Craig's version broke the illusion that masculinity must mean emotional repression. His Bond didn't become weaker by being vulnerable. He became more relatable, more human. And this shift contributed to a broader cultural reimagining of toxic masculinity, showing that strength can coexist with empathy, and the true heroism lies not in shutting down your emotions, but in facing them head-on. To me, Daniel Craig didn't just play Bond, he redefined him, and in doing so helped reshape what masculinity can look like on screen. And I still remember that 2018 moment when Craig, still playing Bond at the time, was photographed carrying his young daughter during a walk. Men on social media immediately started mocking him. British TV host Piers Morgan even posted, "Oh, 007, not you as well," emasculated Bond. But Craig himself responded calmly and received strong support from the fans and reasonable voices alike. This reaction also showed that audiences were ready to embrace a version of masculinity that includes fatherhood, softness, and emotional presence. And James Bond is far from the only example of how contemporary cinema is gradually reshaping the representation of masculinity on screen and rethinking toxic masculinity. For me personally, one of the most powerful films critiquing toxic masculinity was The Iron Claw. It's rather a tragic and heavy movie based on real events, telling the story of the Von Erich wrestling family. At its core, the film explores how a father's obsession with strength, legacy, and stoic masculinity ultimately destroys the lives of his sons. Spoiler warning. In the movie, only one of the 4 sons survives. In reality, the story is even more heartbreaking. There were 5 sons, and 2 of them died by suicide. The Iron Claw portrays masculinity as a prison. Physical strength and emotional repressions are passed down as a survival tools, but they come at a devastatingly emotional cost. The film critiques generational trauma passed from father to son, and the pressure placed on men to remain invulnerable and emotionally detached, and the real-life price of that pressure. The film also presents toxic masculinity as a performance. Since all the brothers are professional wrestlers, their lives revolve around cultivating a persona. They wear sparkly costumes, shave their legs, and are trained to present a specific image to the world. This supports the film's argument that toxic masculinity isn't innate. It's a constructed behavior and identity imposed on men. We can see similar themes in Greta Gerwig's Barbie. Through the character of Ken, the film humorously but clearly shows how men can feel lost and powerless in systems that equate masculinity with dominance. In the end, Ken's transformation becomes a metaphor for how men can rediscover their identities outside of toxic social norms. At the time of writing this script, one of the most striking recent critiques of toxic masculinity is the Netflix series Adolescence. The show offers a powerful critique of toxic masculinity, digging into psychological and social factors that can push young boys toward violence and misogyny. The story follows Jamie Miller, a 13-year-old boy arrested for the murder of a classmate. Through his perspective, the series explores how online radicalization and societal pressure can distort a boy's understanding of masculinity. The show highlights the influence of Manosphere, a network of online communities that promote misogynistic ideologies, and figures like Andrew Tate, showing how this content can shape vulnerable young minds. The toxic online ecosystem surrounding Jamie, combined with his insecurities and social environment, paints a chilling picture of how modern masculinity can be weaponized. By the way, we have a separate video about Stephen Graham and how he portrays toxic masculinity in his roles, and in this video I actually talk more about Adolescence, so if you're interested, feel free to check that one out. The series sparked intense discussion not only because of its powerful critique of toxic masculinity, but also due to the troubling reactions from some viewers. Although the show clearly portrays portrays Jamie Miller as a product of radicalization and toxic social pressure, some viewers began defending him, presenting him as a victim or even a sympathetic figure. This reaction reveals a chilling truth. Even when the narrative directly highlights the dangers tied to the male dominance and misogyny, there are still viewers who instinctively seek to justify the perpetrator. In online discussions and comments, some blamed the girl, claiming she provoked Jamie and deserved to die, while downplaying the severity of Jamie's actions or insisting on that he simply lost control or went too far. Such reactions show how deeply sexism remains entrenched in our society. They echo the same rhetorics often used to justify real violence against women. This underscores how normalized the defense of male aggression and the disregard for women's pain still are. In summary, masculinity itself neither inherently good or bad. It can embody strength, compassion, protection, and vulnerability. The problem arises when masculinity becomes rigid, performative, rooted in domination and emotional repression, what we call toxic masculinity. Fortunately, more and more contemporary films are challenging and changing this outdated trope. Films like Iron Claw or even Barbie explore how men are shaped and often broken by societal expectations to suppress their feelings or assert control. These stories matter because they offer new perspectives on what it means to be a man, vulnerability, emotional honesty, and mutual respect. By telling these stories, cinema plays a crucial role in helping us all imagine a healthier, more human version of masculinity. Thank you for watching this video. I will be very grateful for your comment. Please share your thoughts. What do you think about this topic, this format? How do you like video in general? Also, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This will really mean a lot to us. And see you in the next videos. Bye bye.